First of all, thanks very much to Bill McGee from the American Economic Liberties Project, someone who dedicated so much of his professional life to aviation, first as a public servant and then as an advocate. And I want to note that this is really the culmination not just of work by our US DOT team, but of a community of advocates like Bill who have stood up for the rights of airline passengers and to make sure airline passengers and workers are better off. I also just want to thank DCA for hosting us, an airport that I experience often as a passenger as well as a policymaker. And I want to recognize our department's OACP, our Office of Aviation Consumer Protection, which is a small but mighty team that has helped millions of passengers get billions in refunds, handling complaints, enforcement, regulation, and rulemaking all at the same time. And thanks all of you for joining us here. This is a big day for America's flying public. It represents the latest step, two steps, in fact, in our ongoing journey as the Department of Transportation under President Biden's leadership to deliver the biggest expansion of passenger rights in the department's history. The news comes as we enter the middle years of America's infrastructure decade, a period which has already seen enormous upheaval and change in the aviation sector. When we got here just 3 years ago, the big question around airlines was about whether they would survive the pandemic. A year later, the challenge was to ensure they could do a better job meeting unprecedented growth in demand. And through it all, we have been focused on making sure that passengers, workers, and the sector as a whole would be better off than before we got here. Telling stories, good and bad, about your flight is an American pastime. From stories of people coming up to me in airports to stories that we formally receive in the form of comments and complaints through our rulemaking processes and enforcement activities, we have heard it all. And too often the things that we hear about aren't just irritating inconveniences. They are significant harms and, more importantly, violations of passengers' rights. And we're here to do something about that. A lot of what we hear from passengers involves refunds, or the lack thereof, for passengers who experience cancellations and disruptions. In theory, passengers are already supposed to be refunded for a cancellation or a major delay. In practice, it often doesn't work that way. We hear again and again from passengers who describe how hard they have to push just to get the refunds that are owed to them. And often our consumer protection team has had to impose multi-million-dollar penalties on airlines just to get them to do what should already be required. Infrequent flyers are especially vulnerable, since they may not know that we are here for them and are often not told about their right to a refund, and too often instead offered compensation in the form of a voucher or miles whose value amounts to pennies on the dollar of what they're actually owed. Or they enter the vortex of call centers and chatbots, sometimes giving up before they get their money back. We're changing that today. With the first rule that we're announcing today, the Biden-Harris administration is now requiring that if an airline cancels or significantly delays your flight, within 7 days they will be required to provide an automatic refund to the credit card that you used to book it, without you having to call or wait on hold or sort through digital paperwork or haggle with that airline. Importantly, we are also changing the refund to clarify that it must be in cash by default, unless a passenger actively chooses another form of compensation rather than the other way around. No more defaulting to vouchers or credits when consumers may not even realize that they are entitled to cash. We're also putting another rule on the books, protecting airline passengers from being surprised by fees. These charges can really add up for things like a checked bag, a carry-on bag, change fees, cancellation fees. Healthy competition requires that as a consumer, you comparison shop, which means knowing the real price of a trip before and not after you buy. So airlines will now be required to show you these costs up front so you have all the information you need to decide what travel option is best for you. We estimate this will save Americans over $500 million every year. From day one of this administration, we have been working to improve the entire experience for airline passengers, from more transparency when you book your ticket, to a better experience when you get to the airport, thanks to the terminal improvements that we're making through the Biden infrastructure package, to the most important part of all, which is safety and peace of mind, secured by better staffing, better technology, better oversight, and better infrastructure. And, of course, knowing that if something does go wrong and your flight is canceled, the U.S. Department of Transportation has your back. That's why we launched flightrights.gov to provide passengers with easy-to-interpret visuals that lay out exactly what each airline is committed to providing you if they cause your cancellation or delay. And we know that that transparency made a difference because within days of my letting the airlines know that it was coming, we went from 0 out of the top 10 to all of the top 10 airlines guaranteeing in their customer service plans that they offer things like free rebooking and meals, and nearly all of them offer free hotel accommodations. Commitments that our department has the power to enforce. Of course, even with the new rules we're announcing today that airlines will be required by law to follow, problems still come up, and that's where our stepped-up enforcement comes in. When an airline is responsible for a delay or cancellation, we have set records for tough penalties, including the $140 million enforcement action against Southwest Airlines for the 2022 holiday meltdown. That is nearly double the total amount of penalties that our department assessed in fines in more than 2 decades before we got here. And the level of toughness reflected in the Southwest enforcement is not an exception, but the new standard for our department's enforcement. Even more important than the fines that go out to the Treasury is what our department is getting back into passengers' pockets, which now stands at over $3 billion in refunds and reimbursements. And last week, we announced a new force multiplier for our efforts, an unprecedented partnership with 18 state attorneys general to help investigate aviation consumer complaints and get passengers results. And we are encouraging the rest of the states to join us, too. Taken collectively, under this administration, U.S. DOT has advanced the largest expansion of passenger rights, issued the biggest fines against airlines for failing consumers, and returned more money to passengers in refunds and reimbursements than ever before in the department's history. This isn't just about enforcing when something goes wrong, it's making it less likely something would go wrong in the first place. When an airline knows that all, instead of just a few, of the passengers on a canceled flight are likely to actually get their money back, it gives them a different set of reasons to put in the investment and the realistic scheduling that makes those cancellations less likely to happen to begin with. To be clear, we want the airline sector to thrive. It is why we put so much into helping them survive the pandemic, and honestly, it's why we're being so rigorous on passenger protection. This will build confidence in air travel at a time when airlines need to do more to secure passengers' trust. And to be clear, whenever it is appropriate, we're also working side by side with airlines operations personnel on things like deconflicting airspace closures for commercial space launches or addressing the congestion in New York's airspace by facilitating larger planes with more seats that can move more passengers without adding more takeoffs. This approach of collaborating where appropriate, pushing hard where called for, is working. After the pandemic, passengers had difficult years, especially in 2021 and 22, but last year, cancellations reached a 10-year low. And this year is off to a good start, about 1.5% cancellation rate, which is well below the norm. But we know there is more to do, and we're not done. We are working on a rulemaking to expand rights to protect the safety and dignity of passengers who use wheelchairs, and another one to ban airlines from charging you a junk fee to sit together as a family. It's all in keeping with President Biden's vision on competition and consumer protection, including cracking down on junk fees to make everything from concerts to inhalers more affordable. These dollars and cents add up for millions of Americans, and our laser focus on making it easier, more affordable, and more convenient to navigate every system in America from healthcare to banking to air travel will continue. With that, we have a little bit of time for questions from reporters. That process will be led by Alexandra. So the bulk of these protections will kick in about 6 months from when the rule goes into the Federal Register. We've been working on this for more than a year, but now it's time to take action. We know it'll take a little time to develop the mechanisms for that money to get back, but we really don't want the sector to drag its feet because passengers want and expect their money back now. So unsurprisingly, airlines are not enthusiastic about us holding them to a higher standard. But I believe that this is in the interest of the airline sector because it builds passengers' confidence in airlines as a whole. And I also know that they'll be able to adapt to this. Remember, when it comes to things like a refund for a cancellation, technically that was supposed to be the case the whole time. It's just it wasn't actually happening in practice. That's part of what this does. It also clarifies what a significant delay is, because up until now it's been up to the airline to decide if a delay was significant enough that you get your money back. Again, in terms of the timing, that's 6 months from more or less now when it gets encoded in the Federal Register. But again, there are a lot of refunds that you're already entitled to and can let us know if you're not getting. We'll continue enforcing that, even as we work to make it more automatic so that passengers go through less trouble. And frankly, our investigators will have more bandwidth because they don't have to chase down these refunds. More and more of them should be happening by default automatically as a matter of course. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so on compensation, we continue to develop that, and to be clear, with this rule on the books, that does not stop or slow the progress that we're driving in terms of a compensation rule as well, though this obviously represents something new for passengers who have those extreme delays. And then, sorry, the second piece again? Oh, yeah, okay. So this is the month when those vouchers as part of the Southwest settlement kick in. And Southwest will now, because we are making them, really lead the market on that. And it will be very interesting to see what other airlines respond, not as punishment, but by way of competition. We haven't yet seen how they're responding. I think it's going to take a little time to see how the market responds to that. But it's certainly, in addition to, remember, what we're setting ought to be the floor, the bare minimum. And we invite and welcome airlines to compete on that kind of benefit, as well as the other things that airlines compete on. Yes? Coming soon. I don't think we have a date for that yet, but coming soon. We are confident of the sound legal basis for this. We believe it's consistent with the authorities that we have under statute. I can't speak to what airlines will do, but I certainly hope that they will, if not enthusiastically, still diligently conform and comply. And by the way, they don't have to wait the number of months that it'll technically take for this to go into effect. They could and should be doing this right now. I really believe this is ultimately going to make the sector better off. Look, we have seen a lot of industry pushback when we come up with a rule. I mean, we've got 2 Class 1 freight railroads that immediately sued us for publishing a rule that most people, I think, assumed was already the case, which is the idea that you got to have at least a couple of people on board a giant freight train most of the time. So we have seen some pretty shocking responses from some industries to being regulated. But you know, what we've seen so far is, as we have been tougher with airlines, airlines have leaned into responding to that, sometimes even claimed some credit for the benefits that we're making them provide consumers, which, you know, as long as the consumers get that benefit, they can say whatever they like. So the primary way for us to find out about a violation is through a complaint process. That's part of what's available through flightrights.gov. We have followed up on thousands of complaints. As I mentioned, the Attorney General's partnership is now helping us keep up with that, and it's gotten us results. We've gotten $3 billion and counting back into passengers' pockets. So that system works. I will say, though, by making these refunds automatic, I hope that it creates less need for that complaint process, which could free up our small but mighty team of consumer protection professionals to be more proactive. There is precedent for a process of auditing or spot checking in addition to complaint-based enforcement, but that's only available if they have enough bandwidth to do it. And so part of what I'm looking for, obviously the real purpose here is to take the burden off of passengers, but by making this automatic, it may also take some of the burden off investigators so they can be more proactive. So it really has varied from airline to airline. We've collected tens of thousands of stories and experiences. If it part of how I can answer your question is look at the toughest penalties and fines that we've assessed, and you'll see the biggest violations that we've noted so far. But look, up until now, an airline could say that they're not breaking any rule when they jerk a passenger around. For example, you have a scenario where you get an extreme delay, like 6 hours, 9 hours. You're not even going to make it to the meeting or the wedding that you were going to unless you book a different flight. That different flight is on a different airline and it costs more. And then the original airline on the canceled or delayed flight maybe gives you a voucher. Up until now, even if we were trying to hold them accountable, they could say, hey, we gave them a voucher, we followed the rules. So this clarifies that to say no. You get your money back unless you, the passenger, want something different. So things like that, I think, speak not just to violations, which we're always trying to enforce against, but things that airlines claimed were technically not violations. We're clearing that up here. Same thing with the transparency and the fees. Yeah, all of this is informing the FAA's ongoing process with Boeing under a microscope. I think there was a lot of attention in past years to the design of the aircraft. Now there is an equal amount of scrutiny on whether they are being manufactured in a way that conforms to that design. One thing I would note is that we are now more or less smack in the middle of the 90-day clock that Administrator Mike Whitaker set Boeing on to deliver a comprehensive plan on how they are going to do better. That's going to be a very important part of them being able to prove to the FAA's satisfaction that it is acceptable for them to increase their production. We're not going to let them do that until they have satisfied the FAA that they can do it safely. Any plane that I or you get on today is flying because the FAA has determined that there's no barrier to it safely flying. And anytime there's a concern, anytime that there's a gap in that confidence, that plane doesn't go. Yeah. Anything related to the criminal justice process, I have to let DOJ speak to that. But what I will say is that the families have played an extraordinarily important role in shaping American policy and, frankly, in shaping my personal perspective on what's at stake in safety, especially when it comes to Boeing. Pete? We didn't get Pete yet. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is a real issue. Multiple airlines have made us aware of how this is affecting their plans. They've also been creative in how they're adapting their fleets to try to manage it, given that the deliveries might not come in as expected. But my certainly the administrator's instructions to the FAA, which I concur with, is to think only about safety. The commercial and economic concerns are there, but that's just outside of the realm of the FAA's priority, because all that other stuff is multiplied by 0 if we don't have confidence on the safety piece. I know Pete had one, and then we probably got to go. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to link to things that are still being investigated in terms of cause. What I will say is that the heightened attention to runway incursions has propelled, I think, a healthy level of attention on Capitol Hill and in the country to how we make sure that our controllers are rested enough, are well equipped enough with technology, and that we have enough of a controller workforce to meet this growing demand on ATC. It's why our budget for next year includes even more controllers to be hired than we had this year. It's why we have reversed the decline in controllers. It's why we're asking for the first time for mandatory account that would allow the FAA to plan on technology. In terms of the numbers of runway incursions, they are rare, and the numbers we're seeing are consistent with what we've seen in recent years, but the only truly acceptable number is 0. And I would point to the JFK incident as an example of just how tightly we watch these things, that even a plane coming 4,500 feet away from another plane is closer than it should have been, and we treat that as a close call. Thank you. Thanks.